Hello and welcome to this webinar panel discussion hosted by a world leader in building analytics software, CIM. Our topic today, as you've just heard, is the energy blind spot. Can buildings get more from their data to drive energy costs down and achieve sustainability goals? Your chair for the next 60 minutes, my name's Jim McClelland. I'm founder and editor of CIM, home to both the magazine and the top 500 rankings. Joining me on the panel this morning are Conor Murray, Vice President ASHRAE, Ireland Chapter, Christine Turner, Senior PPA Manager, Ørsted, Leon Izbicki, Associate for European Natural Gas Energy Aspects, and Paul Walsh, General Manager at CIM. It is all live, as you will see. We are on a tight schedule, so if you have any questions for our panel, please do pop them in the chat box and we'll try to get round to them in the final part of the session, plus maybe pick some up offline after the event if needs be. So a little bit of background first in terms of the context for this debate. So CIM has recently conducted an insightful piece of research with facilities managers from large high-tech manufacturing plants across the UK. Primary purpose of this research was essentially twofold. One, to establish whether industry and the C-suite is correctly focused to achieve sustainability goals and cut energy costs. Plus two, to identify what areas are driving energy usage in manufacturing. In addition, CIM wanted to understand the barriers to implementation and, more importantly, how data can truly help to deliver on the energy objectives of these high-tech manufacturing clients. So everyone in the session today will receive a copy of this research after the event in the form of an ebook entitled The Energy Blind Spot Report. By way of a bit of background though, and to give you a taster for our debate, I'd first like to share a few key takeaways from that research that CIM did with 100 facility managers from high-tech manufacturing and life sciences. So brace yourselves, here comes the stat attack before we start. So first up, 87% of facilities managers say CapEx constraints represent a major barrier to improving energy performance. Only 30%, however, continuously monitor carbon emissions, and still 92% believe they are more than quite efficient on energy performance, and we'll be getting into some of these seemingly confusing and conflicting numbers. 34% say HVAC is their site's biggest energy cost. Perhaps not surprising. Yet, only 35% of the C-suite consider HVAC costs a priority. Riddle me that. 62%, that's nearly 2 out of 3, believe they are deficient in terms of data collection and analysis. 1 in 3 believe their BMS is inadequately commissioned, with more than a quarter, more than 1 in 4 surveyed, saying 40% of alarms are not actioned. And lastly, 40%, 4 out of 10, still performing just reactive maintenance. So there you are, a few numbers, and we'll be unpicking some of those details and that data as we go through the session. Give you a little taste of the findings. Food for thought. Right, enough from me. Let the debate begin. So, Paul, I'm coming to you first with a customer experience question to kick us off, if you like. So, working with numerous manufacturing facilities teams as clients, this research I've given a flavour of. Do you see it as an accurate representation of the challenges your clients, are seeing? Does it make sense to you, Paul?
Yeah, so I suppose, Jim, I've been working in the high-tech manufacturing sector probably for 20 years, and I absolutely what the research has found, it kind of corroborates a lot of what I've seen. I've walked in the shoes of these facility managers, and what jumped out to me when you talk to these over 100 facility managers across the high-tech manufacturing and life science sector in the UK. What struck me, I suppose, from a human level is that there is a huge level of complexity in the day-to-day operations of the facility. So those type of statistics you mentioned around, the BMS being poorly commissioned, the facility manager constantly being in that reactive mode, being unable to get data from different sources on site. They're kind of day-to-day operational issues that make that job extremely difficult. extremely challenging, I suppose. And then what I see from the research coming out as well is there's externalities that are compounding the challenges that the facility manager faces. And these are things like COVID, which is thankfully easing, but you now have the energy prices, which are ratcheting up. So even if the site is using the same quantity of energy, their cost of energy has gone up significantly in the last 12 months. And these are, I suppose, coming through in the research, in that, the availability of capex, 87% saying that they find it hard to get capex to do energy efficiency projects. And I think that based on what I've seen from the research, those externalities are driving that lack of availability of capital. So I 100% was delighted to see the research aligning with what we see on a day-to-day basis with our high-tech manufacturing clients.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. So you rightly flagged up the complexity, and that's a forever challenge on a day-to-day basis in terms of running and management. But you highlighted it's the externalities, and we'll be looking actually ideas of demand shock later on as well. But externalities such as COVID, energy costs, which of course are making headlines daily, and they are influencing and driving the lack of capital significantly. So now, on top of all those challenges, obviously, as you're flagging, we were already facing an energy crisis, let's not forget, with oil at maybe $100 a barrel before the terrible invasion of Ukraine. Now that figure, I've seen it up near $140, and that's in fact the highest since 2008 and one of the highest ever. So inevitably, we have to talk about energy costs. Catherine, if I'm coming to you here then on this, from your perspective, please, how is the market looking? I know it's challenging with respect to the energy crisis and future pricing threats. How will it affect industry? Is manufacturing doing enough? So give us a perspective, please, on this, Catherine.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jim. It's, as you say, it's certainly a hot topic and a difficult one at this time. And I think it's important to kind of, first of all, bucket these threats and these risks into two different areas. So one are really the fundamental drivers of the market, and the other one are more is the risk premium kind of the uncertainty. And I think it's worth just taking a step back and understanding where we have come from over the last year to then think about where we could be going to. As you mentioned, prices were high even previously. So we had COVID, where actually we saw prices fall, demand fell, and prices fell with that. And everyone, people were talking about what's the lowest price going to be, where's this going to fall to? And then as we came out of the lockdown, we saw demand increase actually a lot quicker than expected. And really then in the UK, it became a perfect storm. We had April and May as a real cold snap, which actually meant we then had much lower gas storage than we anticipated having coming into the winter. The French nuclear were running lower. The interconnector between the UK and France also is down. And it was also a very low wind year. And all of these were the contributing factors really last year to the high prices. They were very fundamental factors of supply and demand. And obviously the price increased towards the end of the year. And then got to Christmas. And then after Christmas, we started to see a little bit of let up initially. And that was because there was a slightly milder period. And we entered 2022 with slightly higher gas storage than was expected. And it's key there to say expected. It was not high, but it was higher than where the markets anticipated it to be. And so we started to see, okay, maybe now we're going to, come through the winter and then it's the summer, and we can build up those storages again and kind of come out of this. And as you say, then the geopolitical situation just completely changed almost 2 weeks ago now. I mean, tragically, and how this is then going to impact the market is what the whole market is trying to figure out, and no one knows. And we've seen the prices just rally since then. And a lot of that, I would say, it's the risk premium, because we don't know. We don't know whether the long-term industry and all the different flows and what the market's made up of could be completely different. And that's why all the prices have been increasing, and I'd see is the biggest threat, both actually short-term and long-term. Because right now we've got this risk premium. We don't know what's going to happen. Countries are changing their mix of fuels. We've got Germany and Italy looking to bring on some coal, but still very reliant on that Russian gas. And if there is anything that is turned off, Germany get 40% of their gas from Russia. Europe is very dependent on that, and there aren't obvious sources that can very quickly fill the gap. So that's why the price have rallied so much. We have just in the last day or so or even just yesterday, I think it was, some of that risk premium being corrected. Prices get very high, it needs to be corrected. So I think the threats going forward are still the same. It's still the gas. Where's it going to come from? What's the supply mix going to look like? And what's going to happen on the geopolitical? And it's tough for all of industry and manufacturers. And I think they need to focus on getting that budget certainty, something like long-term agreements, PPAs, 10, 15 years, where they can actually then know what their price is and actually not have the exposure to these volatile markets that are impossible to predict.
Thank you very much, Christine, and apologies for inexplicably calling you Catherine, I think, at the start there. So you've given us a very useful short history in terms of COVID, lockdown easing, changes, and the expectations post-Christmas as we started this year. But of course, the geopolitical situation has changed everything, turned it all on its head dramatically. And you're looking at risk premiums. And I thought you made a nice point about the mix of fuels, because we also need to remember that in some cases there are substitutions and alternatives and changes of plan in the short term. And for industry and manufacturing, you flag the need to have some kind of budget certainty, which is effectively to help them weather some of these shocks that are coming through. So similar question then to Leon, if I could bring it now to you for your market view and your feeling about the trends and risks, picking up some of what Christine just said there.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's, in addition to what Christine said, we need to understand how exactly European gas markets normally work and balance. And this is usually through the switch of gas to coal in the power sector. So if we have an abundance of gas, we are usually burning more gas in order to generate power. And if the market is getting a bit tighter, we're replacing that gas with coal. What we have seen over the last 7 months, essentially, so since Q3 of 2021, is that we have blown through this fuel switching range in terms of prices because of significant concerns on the supply side, right? So in 2021, it became apparent that Gazprom was not going to supply additional spot volumes of gas to the European market, and that it was sticking to its contractual obligations, which just impacted how European traders were actually viewing the market in terms of how much supply was going to be available. We have seen the exact similar dynamic happening throughout the course of 2022 so far. So this really means that there is just a lack of supply in the market. And the fuel switching range just simply is not enough anymore to try and liberate volumes to put into storage ahead of next winter. So what we're seeing right now is that the market is pricing so high that it is trying to destroy industrial demand for gas. So from energy intensive industries, for example, such as ceramics or things similar to that, even also the refining sector. And these unprecedented price levels are doing exactly that. So the question really is, how long will that continue? And from our point of view, at least from our balances and from what we're assuming with Russian supply, we are assuming industrial demand destructions to really continue throughout 2022 and also into 2023, simply because there isn't enough available supply ready to make up the lost Russian volumes.
Excellent, thank you. And ominous there, as you said, we've blown through the fuel switching range. Availability of supply obviously is critical and struggling to liberate volumes. And as you pointed there, there's a risk of destroying demand for gas. And you flagged up, of course, that this isn't just going to be a 2022 problem. We're already looking at through into 2023 and onwards in terms of the ramifications. So now, if I come to you, Connor, and we're delighted to see you now on screen and your slant on the energy costs. So taking on board what Christine and Leon just said, plus, if I remind everybody that the survey result that revealed 34% of high-tech facilities managers said HVAC is their site's biggest energy cost. So, Connor, is it fair to say HVAC is driving energy usage at the minute, and where is the focus needed going forward, please?
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to contribute. And I think what's really important here is that in high-tech facilities which occur across all life science sectors and pharma, biopharma, medical devices, data centers, semiconductor facilities and other high-tech industries on flat panel displays, TVs, chips for mobile phones, everything we use are huge users of energy. And obviously part of that, the environment has got to be protected internally. Therefore, HVAC contributes a huge amount in terms of the amount of air volume, as well as air conditioning, of humidity and temperature control and pressurization. So they're big contributors to that. And I think what's really important out of this report is that number one is very important, but number two, the data that captures where the energy sources are coming from in the individual areas are really important to allow HVAC and facilities managers to work out how best to manage them. There's a number of ISO standards. There's the new one on 14644-16 giving guidance. And there's numerous resources on the ASHRAE website internationally available to around building decarbonisation, sustainable futures, because finally I would say we're custodians on this planet and we need to protect our environment and a sustainable future. And the only way to do that is by understanding the data first and foremost, and then having the strategies to manage it.
Thank you very much, Connor. So we're looking at across all facilities, we're seeing obviously huge demand, but as you flagged, crucially, it's the data that is critical here to be able to identify the hotspots, the where, what, when, why. There are standards, as you said, ISO standards, but crucially, it starts with the data. And if you like, then I'm coming now to you, Paul, in the sense of energy efficiency. So 27% of our survey respondents rated their facilities as highly efficient. 65% rated them as either quite efficient or average. However, fewer than 1 in 3, 30%, admit to continuously monitoring energy efficiency. So these are conflicting numbers we're getting here, Paul. So my question to you is really, how do we make sense of some of these responses?
Yeah, I suppose what we see is a lot of the clients we deal with are trying to align to the energy management standard, the ISO 50001, and that dictates, I suppose, a level of reporting out around your energy consumption and breaking it down into what's called significant energy users. And typically what we've seen, and the survey has corroborated this, that 35% of the site's load can be HVAC and controlling some of the spaces that Connor touched on there. So I suppose what we see is and it's interesting that the data has shown this too, that a lot of facility managers would assume that the BMS or that the facility management contractor is operating their facilities efficiently. But the gap between what's happening in reality versus what the facility manager might think is happening is often quite big. And I think what we see is a lot of opportunities for optimization of HVAC by unlocking these data sources that are on site and using those data sources to inform on-site facilities teams how specifically they can optimize their HVAC systems. So that kind of would maybe help make sense of the stats that we're seeing.
Excellent, thank you. So yeah, I mean, they are conforming perhaps to energy management standards, but potentially they're relying on their BMS, and really you're saying it's a question of mind the gap between what they think is happening and the reality of the performance. And if I could just ask a little follow on here with you, Christine, is this kind of lack of real visibility and shortage of data, is that typical in your experience? Is that common? I think you're on mute actually, Christine.
Thanks everyone. It's only been 2 years. Yeah, I think there's always a bit of mismatch between data and then kind of conclusions and actions from that. Sometimes it's the data's there, but it's not analysed, I think is probably the most key thing. And people are actually sort of swarmed with data, but don't necessarily know how to get the most relevant conclusions from that data. And I think that's where some of the mismatches in the numbers could also be explained. And I think it's a little bit as well comes to, and we'll probably move on to this, but how much focus there really is in this area. So back to what Paul mentioned as well, between kind of meeting standards, but also maybe doing what's really required to make sure you've got the most efficient system and doing everything you can. So I think that's where you can actually see an explanation between where there might seem some numbers that are contradictory.
And Jim, sorry, one point that I might kind of stitch the two together here is that, and maybe I'll share a story, an anonymized story from a client site, but we were deployed in a building in 2019, and the building was only built in 2018, and it was built to LEED Gold at design standard. And when we went in, the facility manager said, "You'll find very little that's wrong with this building. It's nice and brand new and shiny, LEED certified at design." But we went in, and after 8 weeks, we had reduced the energy consumption by 38% on that facility, because the difference between the way the building was designed and the way it was being operated was huge. And we found that, again, the data was informing us that, you know, the building, and specifically the HVAC on this building, was very poorly commissioned, and the BMS was not doing what it was originally designed to do. So that's an example, I suppose, of how, you know, the gap between standards and the gap, the operational day-to-day performance of buildings can, you know, quite easily be reduced, if you like, through data analytics.
Sure, thanks. Nice case study example there. And as you say, the sort of, as Christine was saying, the mismatch between intention and action, you know, they are maybe swamped with data, but not with analytics, intelligence, effectively not understanding. And also perhaps a question of focus, but there you see 38%. There are still some quick wins. There is still effectively some low hanging fruit. You know, there are opportunities here with these challenges and risks for sure. So nice. So we're coming around to one of what the survey flagged as a fundamental stumbling block, if you like, and that's CapEx, you know, and also some credibility questions here I'd like to tease out, because what we were seeing there was roughly a third of businesses claim to be motivated to reduce CO2. Yet 87%, that's really nearly 9 out of 10. The same survey said CapEx, major barrier to progress. So we have to be asking, can they really be that focused and motivated? Are they putting their money where their mouth is and investing in these commitments? Is industry and business doing enough to tackle rising energy costs and the impact on their operations and ultimately their profitability? So Christine, if I come to you here, so to put it bluntly, it seems the C-suite is coming up short. Why is this?
Yeah, I think this is something that we've seen for a long time, and is always a big obstacle. I would say things are moving in the right direction, but just too slowly. So even it's like 4 or 5 years ago, I remember, so kind of coming from our side in terms of where we can maybe really help tackle those energy costs, and what I was mentioning before about actually making long-term plans for your energy costs and locking in those prices and thinking more than just the 2 or 3 years ahead. Yep. It's always been a stumbling block. And I'd reach out to sort of industry 4 or 5 years ago to talk about long-term sort of power purchase agreements where they could get renewable energy, get that budget certainty. And generally, you wouldn't get much response at all. Now we're starting to get a little bit more kind of buy-in, and people want to, either from their sustainability targets or from their, you know, budget certainty, are starting to pay a little bit more attention, but not then possibly putting the cash forward. So not wanting to take that risk of saying, yes, okay, we will sign up to this for this length of time, and knowing that this is the cost, or we will build this and we will do this energy efficiency. And sometimes the extra step of taking a decision that might mean it's a monetary decision that goes outside that 2 or 3 year horizon, often therefore it's board level in these companies, that's still where we're seeing a major obstacle from my perspective.
That's nice analysis, thank you. Yeah. So a positive note up to the point that you are seeing progress, but it's slow. And of course, as we all know, time isn't actually on our side, you know. So, but budget certainty is what they're seeking, and you are seeing some buy-in on the up, but not necessarily accompanied by cash going up. And a lot of this really is timeframes, as you suggested, that, you know, boardroom timeframes and the 2 to 3 year cycles potentially are not always in sync, and this is affecting some of the CapEx decisions. So Paul, if I bring this question to you now, and then I'll go to Connor, but Paul first, if I were to say, challenge you, so is this green wishing, i.e. optimistic thinking, or is it a bit more like greenwashing? Is it a bit more of a deception here, Paul? Can we believe, is there credibility to these suggestions that they want to tackle the problem?
I think I echo what Christina said there, in that in the last 2 years, I've seen the dynamic change at senior leadership level. Before, they were paying sustainability and energy efficiency. They were really paying it lip service. But now I genuinely see a step change in the leadership's sponsorship of energy efficiency reduction and sustainable energy generation. So PPAs, as Christine's company are heavily involved with, are fantastic. But I often feel what management sometimes struggle with is they feel that the sustainability journey has to involve a significant deployment of capital at the outset, and that can often paralyze them into inaction, if you like.
Yep.
And I feel that they often miss the opportunity to optimize what they have, and then you can get energy reduction and sustainability wins from that, and on a roadmap to carbon neutrality, if you like. At some stage, capital is definitely needed. It will just take longer to unlock that capital, as we've identified in the research. But I do think there is short-term benefits or wins that can be done that can deliver demand-side reduction. It's definitely not greenwashing, because you can see the kilowatt-hour consumption reduce. So I think management are beginning to realize that, 2030, a lot of companies we deal with have a carbon neutrality goal by 2030. That is a cliff edge, and it's only 8 years away. And procuring, carbon offsets is going to become incredibly expensive according as we get nearer. So the more work they can do now, the better in terms of reducing their day-to-day demand side consumption.
Excellent. So you do agree. You see the dynamic changing. It's less a case of lip service, which might have been happening previously. It's a step change, but the call for upfront capital is typically what leads to a degree of paralysis and also missed opportunities. And a nice point about carbon offsets. We've run a news piece on CIM about the potential for the costs involved to be rocketing over the next decade or two. So that is not going to be a cheap solution going forward by any manner of means. And you mentioned at least one key word, which I'd like to bring around to Connor, actually, if I could bring you on this as well. So I know, as well as technical resources, your decarbonisation task force, I think you have at ASHRAE, has been created to provide leadership. That's L word, leadership, Connor. Is this the missing piece of the climate jigsaw for business in many cases?
Certainly, Jim, I think that's a really important part. And just so no, I've added into the chat line, as we were going through this discussion, some notes on resources and a web link to the ASHRAE website, which gives details and makes specific mention to this building decarbonisation, sustainable futures. But just to echo some of the points that's come through, particularly from Paul in his last comments, right? There are easy wins in HVAC systems and energy reduction right now. And there's a new report coming out from ASHRAE worldwide in the summer, report 1604, on demand-based ventilation. So not only is the data capturing availability in software and intelligence systems that are coming from like CIM, you also have the sophisticated control systems where in fact you can actually detect indoor air quality and room environmental conditions, give feedback to a ventilation system, and on a demand basis it can actually work in consort with meeting the requirements, including enthalpy control. There's lots of techniques. And in fact, the industry has significantly moved towards that in the last 5 years. So there are numerous programs going around the world. And part of social and corporate responsibility, there are real movements and strides and forward. So I don't think this is a paper exercise at all. I think this is having real effects across the board. And the more data that's captured and the more success stories like the anecdotal evidence Paul has given, the more people are pushing for it. We're finding a huge response across the world in different areas on that. So this is real, it's active, it's occurring, and there are real savings being made that are recorded, that are real. And CapEx does not become an issue if you have ROIs within the space of 1 year. And they're immediate. And you have a lot of banking commercial systems offering deals like on lighting to go to LED. You convert to LED and we'll front up the money to make the conversions on CapEx, and we'll take the return on an OpEx side. So these are real today and real value happening right now.
Excellent, good to hear. So again, we're hearing echo. There are easy wins in HVAC and energy reduction. Progress being made on demand-based ventilation, for example, and sophisticated controls. As you say, not a paper exercise anymore. And you're even talking about 1 year ROIs. If I could just ask you one little follow-up there, though, Connor. This is exciting innovation and progress. Is the message getting through, though, to the non-technical people in the C-suite about the opportunities here in terms of the business strategy?
Okay, so now this is probably a real challenge, because as engineers, I'm coming from my background, Ashray, we tend to discombobulate, confund people, to use a Harry Potter expression. And so we have to work very hard at simplifying the message. The deliverable needs to be explained, but we need to do a top-down approach, which is talking about carbon neutralization, near zero building emissions coming out and meeting regulatory requirements. So the drivers are there from a corporate and a regulatory and the EU directives, but we actually have to translate it into real world, simple information, simple mechanisms. And we need to start off by easy wins, which people want to hear, quick returns on capital, and make the business model simple, like funding through commercial reasons, as you have like LED lighting now. There's a lot of programs now where companies will come in, change all the lighting for you, and they get their payback during operations. We have to make it easy for the decision makers and show the information in a very simple way. And I think this ebook is going towards that by presenting the information and the findings. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, yeah. So you're talking about the top-down approach, endorsing the idea. What we need is all of these. We need real-world, communicable, simple steps and stories, and those quick wins, because they build business confidence. You get those quick wins in early, people are on board, budgets somehow get bigger and get released because there's a confidence, and there is a confidence factor. Especially when dealing with these risks. Paul, you want to come in?
Sorry, yeah, just to kind of chime in on that point. What I've seen when I've sit in front of senior leaders is like we very much help them join the dots in simple stories. Like they don't necessarily understand the complexities of HVAC optimization, right? But they do understand that there are plenty of data sources on a site, and if that data can be properly utilized or properly distilled into actionable insights, it will allow them to very quickly and very cost effectively deliver some energy reduction. Yeah. And what you have to do is get the management team to follow that kind of bouncing ball type analogy. And they don't necessarily need to understand the technical complexities. They just need to understand that they need, as executive sponsors, to weigh in behind a project like this.
Excellent. And you're helping them join the dots with data, of course.
Exactly.
Now we're beginning to build sort of quite a positive kind of momentum here, but now I'm going to bring this to Leon, not necessarily to burst our bubble, but, we hear a lot of talk about demand shock, which is kind of where sudden or surprise events lead to a temporary shift in demand, often spiking upwards, as we're seeing for terrible reasons at the moment, but also slumping down maybe since COVID. So clearly we're in a desperate and dangerous situation at the moment. But Leon, if you're talking about those risks and that demand shock, where's this coming from at present? And can you give us a heads up what might be next, please?
Yeah, I think what we have seen really in the aftermath of COVID was that we saw a rapid recovery of demand, for example, for natural gas in the industrial sector, as industrial production also recovered from that aggregate demand shock in 2020. But on the supply side, what we have seen is that supply just didn't keep up. And this is really partly due to a reluctance to invest in more upstream infrastructure that would enable us to get more flex on the supply side more generally. So when it comes to, for example, financing more LNG terminals that would be able to ship more LNG from the US to import countries such as in Europe. But I think it's also part of the story that we are making our demand on gas more inelastic. And this is because we are simultaneously also shifting away, for example, from nuclear power on the continent in Germany, or shifting away from coal and lignite. So overall, we're making our demand on gas in the industrial sector, for example, to generate power and also in the power sector more specifically, more inelastic, which means that prices can essentially go through the roof, and you still need to buy that molecule because you have no other alternative. And ultimately, what we're seeing so far is that exactly this is materializing in markets where, as I said earlier, the traditional balancing mechanisms just don't work anymore. So what the market is trying to do is really to generate another demand shock, this time to the downside, to try and free up volumes of gas and also to reduce power demand, for example, from the industrial sector in order to try and balance the market. And this narrative really will continue in the foreseeable future as well. We don't really see any easing in the European balances, both with respect to gas and consequently also power, which means that there is just an incredible amount of pressure on industrial margins, really, which are impacted by these high energy prices. So this becomes a story of whether industrials want to incur the short-term expenditures, so to speak, of capex, which would significantly outweigh the long-term costs of sustained high periods of energy prices.
Excellent, and we're seeing some themes really develop now. So a nice point about obviously rapid recovery, but the supply side, as you said, effectively couldn't keep up. There was a lack of upstream infrastructure. Nice word there. You talked about inelastic demand, and in layperson speak can understand when something's inelastic, potentially it's going to break. And with the moves away from nuclear and coal, we are putting even more tension on that. And you sort of flagged the fact that the market effectively is looking to almost shock back as it seeks some kind of balance and some kind of repair of the situation. But again, it's coming down to some of this timing. You're talking about short-term spend, long-term cost, and I think we're just seeing the timeframes word coming up throughout our discussion today. So nice points there, thank you. So now and I do remind the audience, if they have a question, do pop it in the chat. You'll see a little chat box. You can type it in there and we'll see if we can get to them at the end of the session. So meantime, now we're coming round to the BMS question. So as you heard in some of the stats earlier and at the top of the show, 58% surveyed said BMS was only somewhat helpful in identifying HVAC related issues. 18% said it was either not too helpful or actually not helpful at all. Plus, more alarmingly, pun intended, the effectiveness of BMS alarms, 26%, that's 1 in 4 more, admitted to ignoring 40% of alarms, and 41% ignore 30% of them. These are big numbers. So Connor, if I'm coming to you, for me, these numbers flag multiple risks, overspending, production issues. So do FM teams need help managing this glut of BMS alarms, Connor?
So again, there's a common theme in all the discussions this morning, certainly from the ebook and the CIM report, which is about working from data into information, and then what's even more important is intelligent decision making. So the main reason, certainly in high-tech facilities, in my own experience and Ashrade's experience, is that the BMS is driven by the quality of commissioning. Okay. If you don't commission the facility correctly, you don't do your business resilience and continuity, you don't verify the accuracy of the data, then you can't really work intelligently to make the right decisions. So absolutely, the facility managers need to make sure that the handover quality of the documents are given on the facilities is correct and accurate. And there are numerous approaches within ASHRAE and commissioning processes to ensure that on it. But effectively, when you look at the alarms tell you immediately that the commissioning process was not closed out correctly, because you typically go into a facility and they keep hitting the mute button on the alarms. It just means they haven't been set up right. So you can't expect the users to suddenly, after the fact, put in the alarms correctly if it hasn't been set up correctly. So fundamentally, it has to move from raw data to information collated in the right way, and then intelligent decision making. And that's really where modern electronics, instead of confusing people, need to be structured in the correct way to do that. And that's the future. There are lots of systems available, and more of the work that CIM are doing is really important to get down to where the meat of it is in costs and operational efficiencies, which will save money. There's no question about that.
Excellent, thank you. So, as you say, it really comes down to it's the quality of commissioning and the handover. And fundamentally, it sounds simple, but it's incorrectly set up. You know, in effect, they've started wrong, and that's why they're ignoring these alarms or even have them set to mute, and they're not going to be able to make the best of some of the cost and efficiency opportunities that could come with a system that was giving them intelligent information. So now we're moving into sort of the last quarter of our session, and one of our last questions, but by no means least, is going to be about data. We've been hearing this word repeatedly. So, Paul, I'm coming to you first on this, but 82% told us they use building data to identify areas for action, but only 1 in 3, 35%, use that data to identify the actual high priority actions to take. So, Paul, how can data unlock these energy reduction initiatives so they can get a grip on costs, boost profitability and competitiveness? How does it get stuff done with data, Paul?
Yeah, and I suppose it's a really interesting point. But what we see in every site we go on to, there are gigabytes of data available. We tend to find is that there's a person on site typically that is a BMS expert. There might be a person who looks at energy metering data. There might be a person who is responsible for occupancy or for environmental health and safety. And they are all different platforms and different systems, and all the data resides in silos. So what we kind of articulate to our clients is platforms like Peak have the ability to put some structure on that unstructured data set and normalize and cleanse those data sets to allow analytics to be run across that data set. And one of our software engineers explained it quite usefully to me. He said, it's like we've built a sieve, and you pour the data through the sieve, and the sieve will detect when your plant and equipment is not operating efficiently. And I think by combining the data sets, it definitely allows that sieve to be more effective, and it prevents the point that Connor touched on there around the BMS alarms being white noise. Because what's happening in all the sites we see, and I'm not sure if anyone else on the panel has witnessed this, but there are hundreds of alarms coming into the facilities teams every day, and BMS is typically not intelligent enough to be able to prioritize those high impact items for the site team to go after and to resolve. And data analytics can definitely help to focus the team on screening out the white noise and removing, like one of the stats that came out in the research was around 40% of the facility managers are in that constant reactive mode. They're not using the data to drive any kind of insights as to what might be problematic in the future. And all the indications of the problems are in the data set. So the analytics will help the facility manager move away from that reactive mode and get them into a space that they can be more proactive, and using data analytics to do that is, as we've seen, is a proven technology to do so.
So thank you, sir. It's about being able to structure the data, to normalize, to cleanse, to create those analytics and sieving. I liked your analogy there. And effectively what you're trying to do is you're trying to pick the signal out from the noise.
Exactly.
And we're hearing there is a lot of noise. They're collecting noise, but it's like static. It's like a buzz, and that's why they're tuning out and switching it off. The result is, if they do tune out, they're just in reactive mode. They're only going to do something when they have a problem, which in some cases is late. And of course, all manner of efficiencies and optimizations get lost. So, Connor, I don't know if I could bring you in on a little bit on that and your thoughts on how data drives decision making. And I'd also like to pick up one question we had coming in from the audience, which was the impact of cooling and AC on the energy requirements and how to make that more efficient. So I wonder, Connor, if you could just pick up how data drives decision making, and then also there's an audience question about cooling, particularly energy and efficiency. So those two things.
Okay, so taking those in sequence, right, and that's a really good question from the audience, right? The data, and with this is a continuous theme we talked about, and I can only repeat what I said, that we have vast amounts of data available to us, but it's not structured, collated, and presented in a form that we can make intelligent decisions on it. There are sophisticated control systems, there's sophisticated technologies, but if they're not set up correctly. So I'll go back and say again that you need the software systems that can make the intelligent decisions, but if the data is not captured right and the sensors they're not calibrated, so the commissioning process is probably the number one requirement. So effective design that must be confirmed during the commissioning process is absolutely the starting point. Then the data you're capturing is the correct data. And then you use the models to present the data to make the right decisions. Because when you present the decisions to the decision makers on the financial side, the numbers are obvious. There are easy wins across the board every time. And the continuous anecdotal evidence I can give you is when people apply it correctly, they say to themselves, why did we not do this years ago? We've been wasting energy for years, but we didn't know how to get it forward, okay? So there's the data drives that, and these type of reports are very, very important. And ASHRAE, CIBSE, all the other organizations are doing that, right? If I could move on to the audience question. I mean, cooling is an extremely important part. Environmental control. So I would add in RH control, and unnecessary RH control is becoming very important. Unless it's a process need, you can have quite wide bands. And typically in life sciences, if it's too humid, you get condensation and therefore microorganism growth. If it's too dry, you get infections and dry throats. But in terms of cooling, there's numerous techniques around enthalpy control, where you're looking at free cooling. There's a lot more effort going into air recirculation instead of first air or only a no recirc, through proper filtration systems and indoor air quality. But there are numerous techniques around, and some of the resources in the ASHRAE link that I put on the chat line should be available to you, or will be available afterwards from the organizers. But really, cooling needs to be demand-based. And we typically murder, if I can use that word, facilities with too much air. We need to target air. That means we need the right type of air in the right airflow pattern, so there's no drafts. And there needs to be a lot more integration of the process and user requirements. But the techniques are obviously there. They're being used more and more, and we need to use it in an intelligent way, supported by good data.
Excellent, thank you. And I'll say you're sort of saying there is a sequence, a natural order to these things, if you like. Starts with commissioning, collection, through kind of data analytics to decisions, and ultimately wins. But there is an order to be doing these things, and cooling needs to be demand based. And we're into the last 10 minutes, so I'm going to come to all the panel in a moment for some of their final thoughts and top tips. But I don't know, Paul, if you just want to say a little bit before I do that on that cooling question that we had coming in from the audience and the energy and efficiency. I wonder if you had a couple of little thoughts on cooling, Paul.
Yeah, look, cooling is an interesting one, because I suppose in the Northern Hemisphere, we can use a lot of the external outside conditions to cool a plant. But what we see is a lot of what Connor touched on there, that there's excessive cooling, or there's mechanical cooling being implemented at times when it doesn't need to be. So it kind of touched on everything we saw, or we touched on in the course of the panel discussion. But I suppose what I'd like to kind of chime in on here is, it's great to see the Connor's attendance at the panel discussion today. It's like the company or the industry bodies like ASHRAE, and he mentioned CIBSE. They are now rowing in behind the realization that energy reduction should be the first cab off the rank, and it's almost an independent corroboration of what we have been saying for years, right? And that the facility managers now and the leadership team now say, okay, this is no longer a sales pitch from companies like CIM. There's external companies or external industry bodies telling us that we should be doing this, and it's fantastic to see, right? It's great. So that's my point on that, Jim.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to come now round the panel. It's going to be like just a minute or two each, because we're into the final minutes. We're using every bit of this hour. So if we're bringing this together, then I'm going to do it under the banner of net zero. So as I think Christine mentioned earlier, we're kind of experiencing the perfect storm in a sense at the minute with net zero targets. We've got skyrocketing energy prices. global conflict, of course. We've also had COVID, Brexit, supply chain disruption, you name it. So I'm coming to the panel now for just some final top tips and takeaways. What would be the key things you'd say? How should site leaders embark on their sustainability journey in this scenario? So imagine if you're starting on your sustainability journey, or you're tasked in your role with driving the engine of sustainability, but you're in this super challenging situation. So I'm going to run around the panel for your final thoughts. What would you suggest they should be doing to try and see their way through this? So Paul, if you kick us off, please. What are your top tips? What should they do?
Look, my top tips on this, Jim, are the leadership team need to get some kind of momentum behind sustainability programs, and a data analytics solution like CIM offers, in our experience, offers the quickest, most cost-effective way of delivering sustainability by optimizing existing plant and equipment that leadership can deploy. And then what that does is it generates a coalition of the willing. It gathers momentum behind the sustainability program. It then unlocks capital at future date, because the finance people see that there's an economic as well as an environmental benefit to this. Mm-hmm. My tip to the leadership team would be just to jump in and get started, but definitely not to be scared of the fact that they can, get quick wins very in a very short time frame over the line by using data analytics to do so.
Good stuff. So we're saying leadership, they're wanting momentum. Optimization can get those quick wins. It can get that motor running. So, and a coalition of the willing behind the business case, which really begins to accelerate progress. So, Christine, if I come to you then. So we're in this situation. You're tasked in theory with sustainability strategies towards net zero, but you're starting from one of the worst places on the map, if you like, in terms of that journey. What would be your top tips of where do we start? Please.
Yeah, no, and I think that's following on from what Paul said, where it needs to be a top priority at that top level. The sustainability goals need to be a real priority and not just kind of something that's there that we'll get to. And they're now becoming a priority more from a cost perspective, whereas actually those two things need to be equally priority. And I think that, as if you're coming to it today, obviously it is unfortunate timing, and therefore I think there's still two time frames you need to concentrate. Of course, you need to concentrate on the short term when these prices are sky high, and whatever you can do from efficiency, from demand flexibility, filling any hedges kind of in the short term, but really to also at the same time focus on the long term, because the crisis is happening now today. There'll be lots of focus on this year. But what are the company then doing in the 3, 5, 10-year horizon? And if you can get some kind of certainty on that price, then you'd be protected from these shocks in the future. And so I'd really sort of encourage people, as well as to deal with the now and the today, to think about protecting themselves down the line, so that in the future they would be protected from this sort of activity in the market.
Excellent. Sage advice there. So we're talking top level, real priority, commitment, but also cost certainty. But really what you're saying is need to be thinking both short and long term, running them in tandem. We need the today and the tomorrow. And obviously those two schools of thought need to be synced. So Leon, if I'm coming for you, we're into the last couple of minutes now. So your top tips, this difficult journey, what would you be saying to them? Do first, do now.
Well, I think to just also pick up from what Christine said, the fact of the matter is that while there is some potential for prices to come down in the shorter term because of the risk premium vanishing from the market, what we are seeing is a structural shift in energy prices upwards. And this is, I think, ultimately where you have this nexus really between the short term and the long term, because we're not talking about a short-term spike in energy prices. We're talking about longer periods of high energy prices over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, until we actually get some kind of flexibility with respect to the renewable build out and also other sources of supply, for example, from US LNG plants that are going to come up. So reconciling those two, understanding that this is not a short-term price spike that will vanish and we will see TTF prices or gas prices coming back down again to 2020 or 2019 levels, really makes it an imperative to focus on energy efficiency measures and those short-term optimization techniques in order to reduce operational expenditures and preserve margins for industrials.
Very nice. So understanding that structural shift, reconciling those short and long-term objectives and pressures, as you said, means it's imperative to focus on energy efficiency to gain a little bit of that saving where you can. And final, last minute from you, Connor. So you're speaking to somebody who's starting on this journey. They've got a lot of challenges. They've got a lot of stuff on their desk. What would be the first couple of things you'd say, do this?
Well, I've just put it into the chat line, which to help you guys on it, right? And really, we're talking about starting off and ensuring that we have the right data. And there are sufficient guidance from many organizations out there, and there's many practitioners that can walk into your operations, give you the right guidance, and make easy savings. Mm-hmm. Those easy savings then translate into the more difficult decisions around net zero going into the future. But it starts off with the relevant information. And that relevant information comes from good data, data analytics, and presented in a way to the decision makers on the financial sides to release funding for implementation. And once you release funding and you bank the realized savings, then that promotes the encouragement to go to the next level, which is going to be more difficult, much longer term. But right now, there are numerous areas in easy savings, and there are standards out there and guidance and case studies to show you there today, right now.
Excellent. And nice use of the chat as well to provide some of those resources and links. Thank you. So relevant information, good data, not all data is good data, and that can help release funding. So we were bang on time now, on the hour. So final thought from me. So we've been hearing throughout this session, cost, we understand it's always going to be high on the business agenda, especially short term. In effect, we're talking about the money going out. But taking a more strategic, longer term view, especially where it's a matter of investment, the real money coming in, it's critical. So with the rise of ESG, climate finance, the investment community is going to be scrutinizing performance of built assets against these sustainability metrics. And crucially, they're going to be assessing risk. That's the key word, risk. So what they need to do their job and make decisions around investment and assess that risk is data and analytics. And of course, what they absolutely do not want is energy blind spots. So there you go. That's the plug there to read the report. That's the last thing they want. So in closing, a big thank you to all our panelists, Connor, Christine, Leon, and of course, Paul and our hosts at CIM, to yourselves, our virtual audience out there for joining us today at your desks and on your screen. As I mentioned at the top of the show, you'll be sent the webinar recording, but you'll also get a copy of the ebook report itself, The Energy Blind Spot, full of all those statistics and insights which we've been discussing for this last hour. So thanks again to my excellent panel. That's it for today. I've been Jim McClelland, editor at SUSMEAN. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.